anyway, I was fortunate to introduce Richard, or talk about the series and the role of this book and the Kingdom in the West, and how grateful I am to Richard for bringing who we both agree is the greatest historian to come out of Mormonism into this series with some absolutely phenomenal and unique insights that are, I really believe.
Sorry, don't mind me.
Clip into his beard.
That are truly model histories. And Richard's done a brilliant job editing them. But if you want to know what I think about the whole operation, you can read the prefaces in the 2 volumes. And don't miss the statement by the man Dale called Danny Walker, who he knew as a young scholar, and said was going to be one of the bright lights coming into the field of Western and American history. He couldn't have been more right. Daniel Walker Howe won the Pulitzer Prize for his magnificent history of the United States from 1825 to 1850, I think. What Hath God Wrought. And I think Kurt still have copies for sale?
We did. Do we know? I'm not sure.
Maybe, maybe not. But get them while they're hot. On the kingdom, the future of the kingdom is this. Bill McKinnon, I've been asked several questions about this, but Bill McKinnon's volume 11, which is part 2 of the Utah War Saga, is he's sworn up and down that he will have it by Thanksgiving, which is coming right up. And we will move heaven and earth, or at least I will. I don't know about the publisher, to get it out in 2014. And then I'm hard at work on Redeeming the Lamanites, Narratives and Documents of the Mormon Indian Frontier, which will be volume 16, and the end, done, finis. But anyway, I'm going to do something based on some comments I heard about Richard's wonderful presentation of the Utah Westerners last night. But it was a mystery to those who don't really know Morgan well, which I'm sure doesn't include anyone here. But this will show, I hope, why so many of us find Dale Morgan one of the best historians of every aspect of the American West. Chapter 1, The Calling of the Prophet. This is from Dale's unfinished masterpiece, a trilogy on the Mormons, which he only wrote a handful of chapters for. The new place was 2 miles out the Stafford Road, just beyond the Palmyra Township line in Farmington. Overgrown with great oaks, maples, beeches, and basswood, through which the sun struck here and there into fragments, fragrant growths of sassafras and wild tangles of blackberry briars. The 100 acres were part of the Everson land, owned by non-resident heirs who left it neglected. No one in Palmyra cared who lived there. 10 Smiths, small and large, in the summer of 1818, took up residence on the farm. The tall and active Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy, his wife, had 6 sons and daughters, with a 3rd daughter yet to be born. Alvin, the strapping eldest boy, was 20. Don Carlos, the youngest, was 2. The 3rd son and 4th child, Joseph Jr., was just half past his 12th birthday. All of them were tow-haired and blue-eyed, and their paternal grandfather, Asiel Smith, who had once predicted that a prophet would be raised up in the family, might well have been baffled had his 8 grandchildren been arranged before him, and he required to denominate the prophet among them. It was now 2 years since the family had made the hopeful journey to western New York from the far side of the Green Mountains. 3 successive crop failures had given them their bitter fill of Vermont. The last year on the farm at Norwich, sufficient to convince the most skeptical that it was time to seek out a land of more promise. A foot of snow had fallen in June. Snow fell again in July and August, at the height of summer, and any hardy crops that survived were cut down by the killing frost, which came on September 10th. A year to remember forever, as 1,800 froze to death. It was not the Smiths only who concluded that Vermont, and indeed all New England, no longer had anything they wanted. That is why the quality of that prose, the creation of a world of the past, is why I think so many of us love Dale Morgan. And I will sign as series editor any volumes, not many people. I noticed a lot of people got Richard, but I'm handy too.
All right, let me grab this back.
Oh, yeah.
This high-tech stuff.
Just all.
Well, I'm doing it for the millions out there in TV land. Thank you, Will, for doing that. This, as I said, this series is a fine series. Before I forget, I want to say that we're privileged tonight to have Dale Morgan's nephew, Jim, and his wife, Jackie, with us, and Richard's daughter, Anne Marie, is in the back. We figure if we can pack it with relatives, you know, we'll have a really good time. But we appreciate you coming. As I've said before, Dale Morgan is one of my heroes, and I haven't read everything he's written yet, but that's a goal of mine. I have a really nice Dale Morgan collection, but I haven't read them all yet, but I've read a lot. And speaking of Will, he had this to say about our special guest speaker tonight. As a dedicated research historian, no one has acquired such a comprehensive and sympathetic understanding of Morgan's difficult career as Richard L. Saunders. And you want me to give that exact quote from Daniel Walker Howe? At least the one I selected. He, the Pulitzer Prize winning author that Will was talking about, said this: Dale Morgan, who was such a fine writer and meticulous editor of sources himself, has found in Saunders the editor he deserves. That is very high praise indeed. Richard has been a friend of mine for a really long time. In fact, didn't I sell you your first Dale Morgan book?
First Morgan book, yes.
First Morgan book. Undoubtedly at much too high a price, I hope. I don't remember now, but and you'll confirm that. Richard has a PhD from University of Memphis. He also has degrees from BYU and Utah State. He is the head of reference and a professor at University of Tennessee at Martin, Tennessee. Isn't that funny? It's University of Tennessee and actually in Martin, Tennessee. That's something. He has been, as some of this is repeat for some of you here, because last night we had Richard speak to the Utah Westerners, and some are here tonight as well, so thank you for coming twice. But as I pointed out last night in introducing Richard, he's probably tired of hearing me talk about him, but for most of his adult life, if not his entire life, he has been involved in books, one way or another. He's written, he's edited, he has published. In fact, one of his, we have one here on collectible Mormon books that Richard not only wrote, but published as well. He has been involved in cataloging and in archives, and is a true bibliophile, or as Nicholas Basbane's recently, well, I don't know if he recently coined it, but talked about bibliophiliacs. So, bibliophile and a maniac. I think Richard has the same disease that many of us here have, in probably I won't say an unnatural love of books, but perhaps more than the usual affection for books than most people seem to express. He has, as I said, edited a number of things. He's written many scholarly articles. We have almost all the things that he's done here. I think we're lacking it occurred to me, we don't have the Shoshonian one. Sorry about that. But the 2 volumes of the Dale Morgan on the Mormons, and he'll tell you about that. Also Printing in Deseret, which is a bibliography of the earliest printed works in Utah. He also did a bibliography of Morgan's works called Eloquence from a Silent World. And he has made a name in, I only hear positive things about where Richard has worked in the past and has really made a name for himself. He is currently at work on a biography. Well, currently, it's been a little while. Been doing is doing a biography of Dale Morgan. And in this little write-up that I did, I'll just end with that, saying it is safe to say that no one alive knows as much about Morgan's life and writings as Richard L. Saunders. Richard. I'll let the professional.
Okay, you can hear me now? Probably not. I can't hear myself. We got it? Okay. Last night I talked a little bit about Dale as a person and some of his background. I'm going to throw you a little different bit of a curveball, and I'm going to have to use my computer here because that's my notes for it too. And talk a little bit about why Dale is significant in the study of the Mormons and what his career meant in kind of a larger scheme of American history, because Dale was very much a transitional character. He went from between periods in American historiography and historiology. Dale was, in my view, one of the major characters in the collision, at least in Utah and in Mormonism, between what's called ethical history, or history that is to do something to persuade people to honor, to revere, to do whatever, on one side, and on the other side, he was also he represented himself a new approach to history called historicism that had developed and was developing and is finally getting to the United States, that was really kind of trying to understand, and understand is the right word, he was trying to understand what happened for its own sake. It wasn't motivational, it was after accuracy. Now, Dale had lots of good things going for him. He had a phenomenal memory. He had some good opportunities, and he was just doggedly determined to do a lot of stuff on his own. He was always working at it. I guess you could, if you're going to talk about historicism and if you're going to talk about ethical history, it would really be the difference between historical approaches of, say, Joseph Fielding Smith, who was the church historian, and Leonard Arrington, who was later the church historian, but had a very different view of the way history functioned and the way it worked. Right? Dale got his start in history in 1938, and he was introduced to history in the Historical Records Survey, but he also was introduced to history at a very interesting time in historical work itself. 1926, there was a British guy who had coined a new word to deal with a different brand of history called documentary. Documentary was not a term that had been used until Grierson coins the term, and because he felt it communicated authenticity. After the First World War, the elites in Europe, and especially after the crash in the United States, elites were discredited, and there was a real interest in looking for authentic experience. What did it mean to be an American? What did it mean to be a slave or a colonial, or fill in the blank? or a worker. It was kind of driven by the left wing. And people were trying to understand what it meant to be in the West. What did it mean to be a Latter-day Saint? The quest for documentary, or this documentary style that evolved afterwards, was adopted by the Historical Records Survey right in the middle of the Depression, because the people were trying to understand what it meant to be an American, a regional American, so New England or the Southwest or the Midwest or different places. What did it mean to be a regional historian? Things like that. It grew out of progressivism, which was a middle-of-the-road attempt to understand and to better universal conditions. It was really looking for that authentic experience. It was adopted by the WPA and by the Historical Records Survey partly because it was those groups were looking for lived detail. What did it mean to be there at a particular time? Documentary didn't rest very heavily on interpretation. In fact, they wanted to present people in their own terms, in their own circumstances, their own facts that they had dealt with from their own records. It was a bit of an antiquarian, just simply history for its own sake, and a bit of hair splitting went along with it. But that was the way that Dale was introduced to history. What happened in Tooele County? Where did the name Tooele come from? How come they call it Beaver County instead of something else? Where did Daggett come from? Those kinds of details were the sort of thing that he became interested in very early. And that's what drove him for a long time. He very quickly began gathering source material and finding an opportunity to have source material gathered in the WPA. Fortunately, one of the things that he did that was a benefit for the state of Utah was to guarantee that the WPA papers were put into a public institution. That's why they're at the State Historical Society. And if you go through that, it's a fabulous body of material of just gathered detail that hasn't seen a lot of use since the WPA, but some really good stuff. There's also something else that happens, and Dale, as he starts looking for this documentary experience and talking about people in their own terms, in their own places, the Second World War happens. Now, during World War II, there's a major shift that happens. After about 1924, prior to 1924, reading was the pastime for American everywhere. Whether you were rich or poor, it didn't matter. People read in unbelievable amounts of material. Well, in 1924, there's a new invention that takes off publicly called radio. And people can't listen to the radio and read at the same time. And what happens is, American publishing takes a nosedive. The age of the book, the age of the short story that had driven the 1920s disappears. The short story didn't quite disappear, but it takes a big hit. 1927, there's another invention. Anybody know what that is? Mammy, how I love you, how I love you.
Sound recording.
Sound recording in film, specifically. And almost overnight, there's a new challenge. So there's these two big challenges to American reading. Well, in World War II, electricity is not rationed, but film is rationed because it's made with silver. American film plummets as far as the numbers. Radio expands, and so there's even more readership. There's a decline in popular reading material like the pulp magazines. But there's an upswing in nonfiction. And fortunately, one of the things that Dale does in 1941 makes a proposal to Farrar and Reinert about a book on the Humboldt River for their Rivers of America series. And Farrar and Reinert just didn't buy it. This was not a grand river. It wasn't from the major parts of America. Why in the world would they want to publish it? They decided to take a risk on it. And as a result, they got one of the best books on American rivers I think that's ever been written. Fascinating story of people, of this brackish stream that crosses Nevada that is really, as he says in the subtitle, a high road to the west. So Dale very early learns how to tell stories. He also learns how to deal with a massive detail. A couple of years later, he does another book, matter of fact, this one, for a competitor on the American Lakes. And this one is really where he learned how to put unbelievable detail into a work and not overwhelm the reader the way, say, that Bancroft did with his works. The Great Salt Lake becomes his touchstone and really kind of the way that he wants to write. He wanted to write nonfiction. He wanted to have people read it. And fortunately, after World War II, there was an upswing in readership in nonfiction. The problem is, at the same time that there's an upswing in readership, there's also an upswing in something else. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of GIs coming home after the Second World War that have to get put to work doing something. And what happens is many of those men go into academia either as students or as professors. And so history and the telling of history in the United States shifts. It becomes much more academic. It becomes much less popular for a couple of years, well, for a couple of decades. And all of a sudden, Dale's interest in popular stuff, in popular reading in the West, and this old stuff starts kind of sliding out of fashion. At the same time, there's a rush to credentials. And so Dale, while he's probably one of the most capable people to ever try to get a job in academia, he all of a sudden can't compete because there's people like Hugh Nibley who come home with PhDs in hand. There are others who go into academia and very quickly earn their credentials, and Dale is convinced that he shouldn't need a PhD. He's too good of a writer. And he really was, and he's too good of a researcher, and he really was. But the problem is, if you've got 1 million people applying for the same position, how do you whittle down the number of applicants? Well, the easiest way to do that is to say, okay, we won't consider anybody that doesn't have a master's degree or maybe someone who doesn't have a PhD. Dale had neither. So while he had the capacity, while he had the experience, while he had the capability, he simply lacked a credential to get in and play the game that was the way the game was played in the 1940s and the 1950s. So he had to do something else. Dale goes on his Guggenheim Fellowship and picks up a massive body of material, microfilm, and all kinds of other detail for the Mormons in 1947 and 1948, gets back early in 1948 and says, I'm going to write this book, or I'm going to want to write this book. But he needs a job first. And so he comes back to Salt Lake City in the spring of 1948 and cannot find work anywhere. He tried everything and just couldn't manage to do it. So he takes a risk. He takes the best opportunity he has, and he writes to Stanley Reinert and says, I've got this book that I'd like to propose. It's a nonfiction book. The Mormon Centennial is coming up. It's a good time, or it has just passed. There's interest in the Mormons now. I think it's going to be a good seller. And so Reinert signs him to a contract, and Dale promptly ignores the contract to do something else. He's thinking down the road a piece. And I'm going to skip a bunch of things. He was planning to write, as Will read for you, he was planning to write the Mormons as a piece of nonfiction, open reading nonfiction. He wasn't looking for a scholarly work, but he wanted it to be good. He wanted it to be credible. He just simply wanted it to also be very readable. He was looking for that popular reading nonfiction. It was a fallback plan in 1948. He hadn't really intended to. He simply had to have some sort of an income, and that was the easiest way to get it. The problem was Fawn Brody's work, No Man Knows My History, had landed in Utah and was well received everywhere else in the country except in Salt Lake City. And that worried Dale quite a bit. He was one of Fawn Brody's mentors. He read her manuscript a couple of times. I think he was the one that helped her make that book into something, rather than a polemic the way that J.H. Beadle had written, into something that was really could stand on its own. He was very, very good. He was very generous with his source material. Yes, it was Fawn's work, but he had shaped it very firmly. He knew his book would be similarly received, and he was very much afraid for the second volume that would deal with the time between Joseph Smith's death and about Brigham Young's death, roughly. And that whole part was going to include not merely the Mormons, the Utah Mormons, but the Reorganized Church, the Straying Church, and a bunch of other small schismatic organizations. And he figured if his book was received as badly among believers as Fawn Brodie's was, he was in trouble. And so he decides to go into bibliography and use the work that he was doing in bibliography as an excuse to pull data out of, historical data out of those churches. Well, it was a race against time, and what happened was he simply couldn't make it work. He couldn't do it. He didn't have enough of an income to allow him the time to write without having to make a living. And so he struggled and struggled for a number of years. The publisher, as was getting reports every once in a while, they would check in and say, how is this stuff going? Dale's response was, well, it's nearly done. I'm almost ready to give it to you. And what he really meant was that I've got it up here, I know what I want to say, I just haven't bothered to put anything down yet. And so as finally in October of 1951, the editorial assistant says, Mr. Reinert would like to have an update. Can you please send us the extant manuscript as it is, basically. And so Dale sends them off 4 chapters and then includes, kind of unwisely, a comment that really all these are going to have to be rewritten. And he sends it off. In January 1952, Reinert writes back, furious. By now he has heard for a decade about this book that was supposed to be written, and there's really nothing to it. Now, he was expecting that Morgan wrote the same way that most other authors did. They draft the whole thing, and they go back and revise the whole thing, and they go back and cut it, and they go back and do something else. That's not the way Dale wrote. He wrote under pressure, and he did things in small snippets. And, frankly, he had to make a living somehow, and he wasn't doing very well at it. He was struggling mightily. Reinert canceled the contract in 1952, in January of 1952, and Dale is scrambling at that point. He's got to find some way to earn a living. And he knows that there's absolutely no way that he can fail to deliver another book manuscript if he's going to survive as a writer. And so he writes to the same publisher that had done the Great Lakes book, or the American Lakes series book for the Great Salt Lake. And he proposes a biography of an almost unknown fur trade character by the name of Jedediah Smith. And the publisher's response is, internally, who? Had no idea who this was. And so they actually, the publisher had to go scrambling to find out who Smith was, to find out if he's worth a biography. But they finally decided to do it, and as a result, Jedediah Smith in the Opening of the West has not been out of publication since 1953. It has been in continuous press since then. It's one of the great works of the American West. Dale did it in about 9 months. He took all of the stuff that he had already existing in his files, and he spit it into the pages. Now, at the same time, he was also doing these Mormon bibliographies, the first two of which survive in Volume 1 of the book, and the third one that he does just as the Jedediah Smith book comes out is published and actually released publicly for the first time in Volume 2, if you haven't seen it yet. But Dale did a lot of remarkable work with it. At about the same time after the publication of Jedediah Smith, a little bit after the publication of Jedediah Smith, he manages to land a position, an invitation to join the staff of the Healing v. Jones, which was a major court case between the Hopi and the Navajo about who was here first. Dale was a researcher for the Hopi for about 6 years and had at least some income coming in that way. He also then became an editorial assistant at the Bancroft Library for George Hammond, and Hammond became Morgan's protector in California for a very long time. Unfortunately, that meant the Mormon project simply went on the back burner. He almost got it restarted in 1966 when he almost persuaded the University of California to give him a sabbatical. It was eventually turned down. And then in 1969 wrote a second successful Guggenheim Fellowship application that was funded, but neglected to tell his boss, and it nearly got him fired. He instead decided to retire. He had just enough seniority to allow him a modest retirement, and that would give him the income that he desperately needed to finish all these projects. And there were dozens and dozens of projects that he was putatively working on. Anyway, just said he'd been working on. Unfortunately, in October 1970, he wakes up with a stabbing pain underneath his rib cage on the right side, goes to the doctor to find out what in the world's wrong, and learns that he has metastatic stage 4 colorectal cancer. And in 5 months, he's gone. All of the plans, all of the effort, everything is simply gone. So he's left. Now, why is my volume 2 that you come to hear me talk about different than, say, hold that one up, the Walker book, yep, which was originally published in 1986? Well, my take on things is that Walker missed the boat. He used the wrong manuscript. Morgan had gone back from the four chapters that exist in the Madeline McEwen papers and had started cutting them further. So the manuscript that you see in Dale Morgan on the Mormons is, as far as I can tell, the most up-to-date, the one that Dale set aside in January of 1952. Walker missed it by about 8 months, 9 months. From Dale put other work into it, basically. There was another problem. Walker found the McEwen drafts and basically used the editing of Dale Morgan on early Mormonism as a personal catharsis for getting out of the kingdom. And I heard him say this personally, so I'm not just whistling Dixie. His idea was, if someone with the gravitas of a Dale Morgan could say this about the Mormons, there really couldn't be much to it. What he forgot was that Dale was as invested, as much a believer in the manuscript and the interpretation that he was making of the Mormons as Joseph Fielding Smith would have been. It was just simply from a different perspective. Dale really, truly was a believer in naturalism, and that all explanations of angels and everything else had roots in the mortal here and now. And he decided that, frankly, before he was even introduced to history. He had decided that by at least 1937, 1938, before he goes to the work with the Historical Society. So what you have is a different view of a reality. Now, it still is one of the best arguments and treatments of the very early Mormons. Walker, unfortunately, was a bit too liberal with his editing and included things that Dale hadn't even drafted himself, but fit Walker's sensibilities. So that's kind of the way it is. Now, as an individual, yeah, I'm a practicing Latter-day Saint. I am a believer, but I'm also a historian, and I'm just a little bit skeptical. I tend to reject the binary that it's either naturalistic or it's directly inspirational. I think that there's a middle ground there that we would all do well to remember. You know, I came to, when I was serving as a bishop, I came to understand just how much latitude that the God that I worshipped gave me in pursuing his work on my ground. He let me do a lot of things and make some mistakes. And I think that's what we need to understand, is that there is very much a human element to the stories that are there. Dale did very good capturing the elements that went into some of the major issues in early Mormonism. He didn't, but he was much, like I say, he was as much a believer as other individuals were. Okay? So, having said that, I'm going to throw it open and let you plague me with questions and make them hard ones, because I like the good ones. Okay?
When Reiner canceled his contract, I understood he demanded some money back from
$750. He wanted Morgan to return the advance. Now, I think that wasn't exactly honorable on Reiner's part, but I think he was mad enough that he figured that Dale had strung him along.
Did he ever pay it?
Dale paid, it nearly bankrupted him. But yeah, Dale paid him every cent. He gave him $750 in a personal check that he had got as an advance for Jedediah Smith in the opening of the West. He just literally went from one to, I mean, it's a miracle that he even ate in 1953. It was really tough.
What do you think it was in Morgan's upbringing or his character that made him such a good prose writer?
Native ability. I can't come up with any other He just knew how to write. Now, he was a voracious reader as a kid. He was a devotee of an old literary magazine, a pulp magazine called Argosy, that was full of all kinds of really pretty good writing. And he learned how to tell stories. Even as an undergraduate, if you ever read an essay that he wrote called Insight into Confusion, which is in the University Pen from the University of Utah, that is some pretty sophisticated writing for an undergraduate. I mean, if I had an undergraduate that wrote like that, I'd be very impressed. It's easily at a graduate level or beyond. So Dale had some native ability. He practiced, he worked hard, and unlike his letters, he edited and cut and worked and revised his book manuscripts in ways that he didn't have to do his correspondence. His correspondence was just almost typed out without a flaw in it, just terribly intimidating. I think the most used key on my keyboard obviously is backspace. Okay. What else?
I was intrigued last night when you spoke to the Westerners, you talked about a physical disability.
He was deaf. And that, I think, is probably the most remarkable thing about Dale Morgan is he could hear nothing. Nothing at all. He was completely nerve deaf. And so part of the reason that he got out of Mormonism, part of the reason that he was a profoundly lonely individual, part of the reason he never married, part of the reason he didn't go to graduate school is he could not hear anything. He couldn't interact with people in a situation like this. He published all kinds of really good stuff, but he only spoke twice to groups. 2 times in his entire career. He couldn't hear. There was no way that he could react to a group.
What were the 2 talks?
Pardon?
What were the 2 events?
One was a Jedediah Smith Society event, I think it was about 1965, and I can't remember the other one. But it wasn't, I mean, he just didn't talk. And he didn't accept invitations to speak. In fact, Robert Greenwood, who published 3 of Dale's books, said they were at work on the 3rd one before he actually knew Dale could talk. Knew he was deaf, but he didn't know that Dale could talk until later.
Looks like he has an hearing aid.
Well, that's just a reflection. That's just a reflection of that particular image.
So he was stone deaf.
He was absolutely deaf. There was no hope, and he tried several different times to see if he could find professionals who could help with the hearing. There was no chance. I think what happened was that he contracted bacterial meningitis, not viral meningitis. I think it was bacterial meningitis that created swelling in the brain. All of the writing that I've seen where he talks about his experience points to that kind of a diagnosis. But I'm not a doctor. I can't tell you for sure. Norm?
Richard, did he sign? Did he do American Sign?
No, he did not. In fact, it was the days before sign language was even really invented. He tried to learn to lip read. His brother Bob told me once upon a time that he would sit on the front porch in their house on Hollywood Avenue and was responsible for drilling Dale on speaking. And it frustrated Dale no end because he liked precision. He wanted exactness. And there's actually an essay that he wrote, it's never been published, where he talked about being frustrated to try and work out words that look the same but are radically different when you hear them because you can't see what's happening here. And so he eventually gave up on lip reading. He tried. His mom sent him out to West High School because there was a lip reading program there as a high school, and he just gave it up.
Last night you were a bit critical of Madeline McCune. Can you tell us a little bit more about that relationship? Some of us have some descriptions from him to her in the books that are quite affectionate.
No, he was very enamored with her. Madeline McEwen, Madeline Thurston, Madeline Reeder, was the wife of a very close friend of his and actually the one who referred him to the Historical Records Survey. Jarvis Thurston was Madeline's first husband. He was personally grown up with Fawn Brodie. Was probably one of Fawn Brodie's best friends growing up. They both went to the University of Utah at the same time. Jarvis became a chemistry teacher in Ogden and was a literary character, and actually later earned a PhD and taught at Washington University in St. Louis for decades. And I went and sat in his house. In fact, he later married Mona Van Dyne, who is a poet laureate of the United States. Became poet laureate of the United States. I mean, he worked in high circles. But Jarvis introduced Dale to his wife, and Dale was head over heels with him, being impressed. Madeline had been to Breadloaf Writers Conference, which is the writers' conference in the United States for developing writers. She was a very good critic. She was also basically amoral. I mean, if she needed something, she got it. There was just no hook or crook. And she bled Dale for years. In fact, there's this painfully telling letter in the McEwen papers at the University of Utah where Dale is laying his heart out, and Madeline folds the letter up and doodles Tom McEwen's name across the bottom of it. I mean, it was just mercenary. So I know I have a hard time with Dale. Dale got her job after job. He tried to help her out. He did everything he could, and she just did not reciprocate. She was in it for what she could get.
What was that? What could she get?
I don't know. Whatever she needed at the moment. There's letters where she says, you know, Dale, I really need a rest. She did nothing but rest. I really need a rest. Can't you get some money and find us a place? I mean, it just, and that was the way he, for years, for decades. And finally, I think he finally understood. He writes her this 4-page, 5-page letter that just basically says, look, you're malcontent, basically. And that he still stays her friend. He just finally understands how badly he's been used for years. And I think one of the reasons that he never married was that he was kind of hoping that Madeline would check her second husband and marry him. Wouldn't happen. She would never do that. She had a good thing where she had it. So
There was she also blocked several very good writers from doing a Brigham Young biography,
yeah,
including Fawn Book.
yeah.
And she pretended that she was working on it. And Dale often would say, "Oh, she's got a great book."
She's got this great book that
she
she's been
didn't
working on.
write anything, of any, not a chapter.
She wrote a novel in 1936-37 that Dale thought was really, really good. And Dale was a good critic. He knew literature. And whittled it down to a short story, to a novella, and then to a short story, and then basically into nothingness. And that's the way it was. She was a piece of work. Yep, Kurt?
Well, a couple of things. One, I was back talking to my stockbroker, so I missed part of your talk. Did you specifically answer why it is when he had such a passion for finishing the Mormons, but just couldn't do it? I mean, you had to sort of expand on that last night.
A little bit, and actually it's much more complicated than he didn't have time, but he really didn't have time. He didn't have support that would allow him to write the book he needed to write. Okay, so that was one problem. He just didn't have a job. He couldn't take time to write. The second was he was really, really afraid of what would happen with the historian's office. The church historian's office was now the church library. He had been turned down, he had been led by, actually, by John A. Whitsoe, to believe that being fair and upfront with people, he would probably be gained admittance. And that didn't happen. Joseph Anderson basically turns him down flat and says, no, you can't see anything, but we'll cooperate with this published business if you want. And so he was really nervous about what might be there that would invalidate it. And the idea of incompletion for Dale was just enough to keep him from writing anything. So that was part of the problem. Another big part of the problem, in my opinion, was I think he was out of his element. The Mormons is the only genuinely interpretive piece of history that he ever wrote. Everything else was factual. He could point to documentation. But with the Mormons, he had to go out on a limb and say, this is true and this is not true. And I don't think he didn't think that way. He might have believed that way, but he didn't think that way. He could put together very good arguments, But ultimately it came down to an interpretive model that he wasn't really comfortable with. So I think he was I know he was struggling. If you look at the type of writing that he does and the material that's in his papers, you can see that he is really struggling with how can you make assertions when you don't have a basis for assertion other than the way you feel. And there's a quote that Walker puts in his book that he writes to Fawn Brodie. He says, basically, he says, I mean, you know, let me see if I can get it right. That I'm willing to look to every answer except for the one that the church advances, that angels really aren't happening. He says, if there is no God, how can Joseph Smith's story make any sense? So, you know, he came up against a problem that he couldn't answer, especially if you're going to advance an interpretation. So he was working through that. He was getting something that was workable, but it was really hard for him. So those are three reasons: money and source material and interpretation. What else? Will?
How many of the 20,500 Dale Morgan letters?
20,532 letters in Dale Morgan's collection.
How many?
Now, I get that much junk mail, okay, but his stuff is not idle.
Oh,
There is some stunning research just in the letters.
If you ever can pick up the exchange between Morgan and Devoto, Devoto's letter is in the smallest Stegner's edition.
Yeah, letters from Bernard Devoto.
Yeah.
Yep.
And did Walker include the letter?
He wrote a couple of other ones that were in there. Devoto and he and Fawn Brodie had kind of a series of letters going around arguing about, was Joseph Smith a paranoid characteristic or not? And Morgan finally dismisses that and says, no, that's not an adequate explanation. There's something else going on here.
And Benny Devoto came back with the knives out.
Yeah, yeah. Devoto hated to be called wrong. Just hated it. But, no, that's the way it was.
Yeah. But do you think that it would be possible that I've looked at many of these letters, but a volume on the fur trade, a volume on overland immigration, and a volume on Mormonism taken from the letters?
Dale threw so much stuff into so many letters, I think you'd have a hard time. I stand on what I said in the first volume, that any sort of compilation is just woefully incomplete. Every time I go to my microfilm reader and go through another set of letters, it's like, I didn't see that one coming. I am making what's basically a calendar of the papers. It's the only way that you can deal with it, because he talks to so many people about so many things that's really the only way to do it. And yes, I'm still going through the manuscript material. It is 20,000 letters, and every one of them is pretty much substantive. You can't just set them aside and say, well, I won't look at that person.
But virtually every significant figure in Western history writes
to Dale Morgan.
I just found today the Floyd Risvold collection. Risvold was a postal philatelist who collected an amazing set of Western documents in Mormiana. He had the sales deed for the Maid of Iowa, Joseph Smith steamboat.
Yeah.
And these were all auctioned off for big money.
Yeah.
4 years ago, I think. But there are 14 folders of Morgan Risvold correspondence that I never heard about, and
I don't remember. I know he wrote to Risvold, but I don't know how many there. And that's part of the problem. We think 20,000 letters, and that's a lot. But Dale didn't keep carbons of everything. Personal letters, he didn't keep carbons of. Dale, Madeline writes him 900 letters, 980 letters over the 20-some-odd years that they knew each other. Well, he wrote her probably at least one for one, but there's only maybe 100 in her paper. She purged her files before she allowed them to go to the University of Utah. And he confided in her things that he wouldn't tell anybody else. And so all of the research, he was the one that sent her, the answer to Lorton that you ask is in there, but it's just been purged. We'll never find it again. Just a tragedy. I've added probably another 500 or 600 letters from other sources that Dale didn't keep carbons of. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that there's 14 folders full of material.
I swear, once upon a time, I found Dale's account of how he got, personally, the Lorton Journal, which he called the finest of all the 49ers,
Right.
from the family.
Yep.
And it actually wound up in the possession of a woman who'd married an heir to the Reader's Digest fortune. And he realized that this woman who was set up all edited was totally flaky. She was having seances and was going to rely on the spirits to communicate with Lorton. And so he put the pedal to the metal and made sure that the 5 volumes of
Books,
diaries,
yeah.
which are minuscule, wound up in the Bancroft Library.
Yeah.
And I cannot find where I saw those letters.
And wasn't her biography condensed?
No.
Well, there's always that story that Sam Wallach told me.
How about one more, and then we'll let you come and get some books signed. Anybody else? Brian, are you dying to ask a question?
I'm going to take a liberty here. Jim, would you tell us, would you recall your uncle for us?
Oh, gosh. Some of the fondest memories I had was he would come back to the family almost every Christmas or so. And sometimes he would stay over with my folks, sleep on the couch. He called himself Uncle Oscar. He had a great sense of humor. Each Christmas he would give books. He'd pick out a book for each of his nieces and nephews. Like I got one called The Age of Piracy, and I was looking at the inscription the other day, and he said, you know how far back it goes. He said, to Slim Jim Morgan. You know, it's been a while. Who would have made a rare pirate if only he had just one eye. And he'd always have a cute little quip like that for each of the books, very personalized for all of his nieces and nephews. One time I was sitting down at, I believe it was a Thanksgiving dinner, or it might have been a Christmas dinner at my grandmother's house, and he was sitting next to me, and he decided he was going to prepare my meal for me, and so he put like 1 pea on the plate and 1 cranberry, and you know, just a tiny little dab of, and he'd laugh, and you know, it was really cute. He had kind of a low, I think of it almost as a humming nasal kind of expression, the way he would talk. And but he always had kind of a little smile, or you know there was a twinkle when he would talk to you. He would try and read lips. We'd end up trying to form words on a hand, and he would pick up that way. I had, with an older sister and her husband and a younger sister, we spent a week with him, just a marvelous week out in Berkeley. It would have been 1970, because I was just leaving for a mission to Germany. I had another cousin, a nephew of his, who was in the same mission, and we were really looking forward to it because we understood he was planning on going as part of the Guggenheim Fellowship, traveling to Europe, and the plan was to stop and visit with us, and unfortunately that didn't happen. I got word of his cancer on Christmas Eve in 1970, and my dad told me some fairly personal things about his for someone who said he didn't believe in God, yet he related basically an out-of-body experience when when he was so deathly ill with the meningitis that he remembered looking down and seeing my grandmother praying at his bedside, and then coming to. But just a lot of fond memories of him. Just a terrific man.
He was absolutely devoted to your grandmother.
Oh, yeah.
He certainly was. Very generous with her. Would I'm probably talking too long.
This is one of the few times I don't mind Will taking a liberty. That's a great way
Yeah.
to end this, other than Richard wants.
I was just going to mention this photograph right here that's in the front of Volume 2. This is the one that Dale had picked and wanted in the front of the Mormons. I think it's suitable that it's in the front of this one. The one in Volume 1 was taken just as he was leaving home, really for the first time, as he was beginning as a historian. This one wraps up basically his career as a Latter-day Saint historian, or historian of the Latter-day Saints. I do hope you enjoy it. It's a lot of fun. Please understand, I'm not trying to pick at Dale. I kind of wrote this to help me with a biography. Help me to understand just what it was that Dale was capable of doing, and just seeing a slice of his life that just doesn't get very much notice because of the great works that he did in other areas of Western American history. All right, well, thank you very much.